questions from we're having a conversation. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to a panel titled Access to and Access Through Sign Languages, a panel in honor of Leila Monaghan's scholarship and activism. We're going to have 6 papers this morning, followed by a time in which anyone present and in person or in Zoom will have an opportunity, if they wish, to speak about Leila's legacy and work. And so we'll quickly move ahead to the first paper. Our presenter is Ann Pfister.
Good morning, everyone. I won't be able to stand on my tiptoes the whole time. Good morning, everyone. My name is Ann Pfister. I'm from the University of North Florida. The title of my presentation this morning is History and Individual Histories in Signs Describing Life Before Sign Language. So as I was reading on the flight here earlier this week, a nearly 25-year-old quote from Z. Bauman strikes as pertinent as ever. It says, "One hears today of identity and its problems more often than ever before in modern times." So this was quoted in Obasi's 2008 article, Seeing the Deaf in Deafness. We can all think of multiple examples of how identity plays into an increasing sense of political and social tribalism. Identity politics are evident in fervent tensions that play out online and in real life as people square off to espouse conflicting viewpoints on mask mandates and vaccines, public school curricula, etc. Identity underpins much of the debates over everything from cancel culture to civility at the Academy Awards, to ongoing reckonings with systemic racism and social injustice, to the devastating war in Ukraine. Anthropological investigation renders phenomena that appear on the surface to be distinct, even contradictory, as interdependent. Jonathan Marks presents anthropology as a science of mediation. My teaching and scholarship, probably not unlike yours, are guided by the pursuit of this intellectual dialogue, one that illuminates the interrelatedness of 2 seemingly divergent concepts, science and belief, for example, or biology and culture, as interrelated. Identifying and explaining nuance is a goal that isn't new to anthropology, but perhaps as important as ever. So as we come together in this session to honor Leila Monaghan's memory and the impact of her work, my paper highlights one of the many things that Leila did well, which is to call for an understanding of identities as evolving, pluralistic, and even experimental, as she talks about in her 1991 Sign Language Studies article on the interplay of deaf and Christian identities. This flexibility and complexity is evident in contemporary research in deaf studies, and we're indebted to earlier scholars as they grapple with issues of how to portray deafness as an ethnic and cultural identity, setting it apart from more historically common deficit models and medicalized models of deafness. Decades of scholarship have pointed out to the mainstream important differences in deaf sociality compared to hearing counterparts, and done the important work of advocating for sign languages and multimodal access. Inevitably, dichotomies emerged, deaf versus hearing identities, for example, and big D, little d deaf. So we continuously are tacking back and forth between underscoring difference, which is an important part of what we do, especially as we advocate for language and language rights, and the mediation that Marx talks about. The voices of anthropologists who follow Monaghan's and others' footsteps have maintained the culturally pluralistic model of deafness, pointing out the need for ethnographic studies to contribute to general theoretical discussions while maintaining the focus on the particular. So in her 2010 year in review of linguistic anthropology, Monaghan underscored several themes or lessons that remain critically relevant. And she did it in this creative and memorable way, drawing from Hymes's 2009 idea of mnemonics models for understanding topics. I have school-aged children at home, and perhaps that's at least partially explains why this acrostic approach appeals to me. So you can look at Monaghan's themes or lessons here, and I argue that they're really as relevant and pertinent as ever. Though any of these could be applied to the analysis I'll share today, I'm going to focus on the first two, which is general history and also individual histories as we analyze ethnographic data. But she goes on to say, and again, I mean, I think most of us can find relevance in any of these themes still. So today I'll discuss ethnographic research among deaf children and adults in Mexico City, Mexico. Again, it addresses each of these themes or lessons that force us to recognize the generalized and the particular, and that necessitate looking at differences like deaf and hearing environments, but also that require that reconciling and that mediation. So today I'll look at particular language use in the form of colloquial Mexican Sign Language expressions, many of which do not have a local Spanish equivalent, that describe deaf participants' contrasting language experiences. Mexican Sign Language is Lengua de Señas Mexicana in Spanish, so I'll refer to it as LSM in this talk. So this is an image of a visual method that I developed while working with deaf youth in Mexico. It's a method I call personal history timelines. And the idea here is that deaf youth in a school setting were charting and graphically representing high and low points in their short life histories at that time, right? Because they're young. And as I interviewed Leo, this is his personal history timeline here, a 14-year-old participant about his timeline, he described his inability to understand hearing teachers and peers at the Center for Disabilities that he attended prior to transferring to IPLIAP, which is the name of the deaf signing school that was my primary research site. Leo used the expression mente negra, or black mind, to describe the state of confusion and uncertainty he experienced among teachers and peers who didn't use LSM proficiently. And at the time, Leo didn't use LSM proficiently either. He hadn't learned it yet. Leo's limited ability to access spoken Spanish made it difficult for him to access basic information in the predominantly hearing environment of the Center for Disabilities. Leo contrasted this dark time with his experience at IPLIAP, where teachers and students communicated fully in LSM. That's where he learned LSM. And his ability to understand then became más claro, which is the opposite, or clearer. In the bilingual context of IPLIAP, which again was a signing school, he learned to communicate in LSM, began to understand and learn more. So symbolically, that mental darkness was cleared when sign language or LSM became accessible to him. This juxtaposition of adjectives, dark versus light, described two very different language socialization experiences, one in an oral environment that obscured and isolated, while LSM presented a clearer and more inclusive and enlightening socialization experience. Like Leo, many of my participants navigated between different language environments, each with a different set of expectations and opportunities for learning and participation. Descriptions of these experiences in hearing oral environments and sign-based environments were often described in these contrasting or opposing terms. So Fabus, and this is her here, a teacher I worked with pretty closely at IPLIAP, learned LSM as an adolescent and had an older deaf brother who never learned sign language. As she described her childhood and language experiences, she used several LSM expressions to describe pre-LSM life or confusion in predominantly hearing environments. She mentioned several LSM expressions that I'd seen in circulation, including mente negra, which I just talked about, mente en blanco, mind in white, or mente vacía, empty brain. And again, it's important to remember that each was used to depict oral situations in which information or understanding were restricted. I also heard these expressions when people were left out and felt bored or didn't understand what was going around them. Again, this is not because of a lack of intelligence or an inability of deaf folks to understand information, but because of language modality, which either limited or facilitated interactivity and language exposure. When I asked Fabus to elaborate on the significance of mente negra or black mind, she explained it this way. She said, let's see, here's an example. Out in the universe, everything's dark. If you can, imagine an entire black universe like a vacuum. someplace where there aren't any stars. There's nothing in that space. Everything's dead, empty. So it's negro or black. Ultimately, the LSM expressions illustrate how deaf participants were unable to experience the reciprocity of language socialization in predominantly hearing non-signing environments. For children and adults alike, language socialization happened among signing friends, especially since most of their families were hearing and had limited skills in LSM. However, it's important to recognize how individuality and personal histories affected experience. As I mentioned, Favos's older brother never learned LSM, and as we discussed these experiences and her own experiences, she often described her brother in a mildly disparaging way, especially with regard to language, saying that he never left the house, that he didn't have friends, that he was socially limited because he wasn't fluent in LSM or Spanish. Now, I never met her brother, and her comments are themselves suggestive of language ideologies surrounding supposed languagelessness, which Aaron Moriarty and others caution against by offering up language practices of deaf people who may have limited command of conventional sign or spoken languages, but are nonetheless communicating and languaging. On the other hand, my research among deaf youth in the same setting reveals how in LSM-rich environments where there is context, community, language socialization, and where the right to sign and the right to language-based communities of practice are honored, an ordinariness emerges. Youth participants' photographic images from my Photo Voice project, for example, reveal these ordinary aspects of their lives. And this ordinariness in itself is remarkable, I argue, because it is the evidence of language socialization. And again, this is sign-based language socialization. So these are just a few of the images that some of these deaf youth took. And as you can see, many of them are the images that deaf youth anywhere might take, right? And this was a number of years ago. This is a project from 2012 to 2013. Some of the images were more targeted. We presented several themes to the youth. Some were just images of young people being young people. And that was what I really want to underscore with these images, that that's precisely the point. In a language socialization environment that's rich with language, young people can be young people. So they were experiencing maybe the whims, aspirations, and identity markers of young people anywhere. And again, this is precisely the point. So these ethnographic images illustrate elements of deaf youth identities that were not specifically deaf. Many participants chose photographs that highlight the ordinary aspects of their experiences and identities, which were equally important to them as more, quote unquote, deaf aspects of their identity. So LSM-based language socialization at IPLIAP, their signing school, allowed these youth to become integrated, understood, and expressive young people through LSM and because of that signing community. Yet each deaf child's language socialization process is unique because deaf children often begin learning sign language at different ages and have different deaf etiologies and life histories in that regard. Therefore, deaf people's language-associated habitus forms at different times in their lives. Nonetheless, the deaf participants in this study identified their LSM socialization, not socialization in Spanish, as the habitus forming practice to which Buchholz and Hall refer, to that which fundamentally shapes the way that we are in the world. So this collection of photos showcases how these youth lived and learned, what they valued, how they participated, and the ways they chose to represent and interpret their practice. From this collection of photographs and from my time with them, we can glimpse how the extraordinary and the ordinary aspects of deaf youth identity come together in sign-based communities of practice. So it's nuance and attention to the particular. So to conclude, I offer up my own mnemonic. Throughout my research, deaf youth participants demonstrated their awareness of the importance of LSM, the importance of a sign-based community of practice. Specifically, they valued the sense of community that formed there and that was shaped by shared language. By using data from personal history timelines and Photo Voice, Their memories of isolation when signing was not available to them were contrasted by the value of conviviendo, or community or togetherness, and apoyo, and that's what they received at IPLIAP. So as we know, sign language affords deaf people much more interaction, and the mutual nature of interactivity is perhaps the most crucial component of the language socialization process, because socialization is an interactive process where the individual is not a passive recipient of sociocultural knowledge, but rather an active contributor to the meaning and outcome of interactions with other members of the social group. So LSM gives children and adults the means to orient themselves socially. Communication depends upon positioning and status, or the individual's ability to orient themselves to each other and to their social worlds. In fact, that orientation within social groups is the fundamental goal of language socialization. However, many oral environments leave deaf participants unable to adequately orient themselves, where they can be excluded and left frustrated. So these LSM expressions remind us of the startling consequences of oralist ideologies for deaf children. If they miss out on these early language socialization opportunities, they may also miss out on key knowledge, group participation, and potentially opportunities for well-being and even survival. The insights revealed by these expressions demand our attention and should inspire us all to elevate the importance of language socialization and the right to accessible language for all.
Sure. Okay, good morning. My name is Erika Hoffman-Dilloway. My talk is titled #DeafMom, a Deaf Maltese Activist Strategies for Addressing Hearing Parents of Deaf Children. So I'm going to open with a brief video in which Emily, a young Maltese hearing child who's watching her mother make orange juice, utters the English word juice. Then, when prompted in spoken Maltese by her mother, Annabelle, she provides a multimodal utterance, saying juice while simultaneously performing the Lingua ta Segnali Maltia, Maltese Sign Language or LSM, form orange. We lost the very beginning of that. She says juice at the very beginning. That's fine. Okay. So this video may bring to mind the phenomenon of baby signs, through which hearing parents teach their hearing children signs to ostensibly help enrich their early language production skills. However, this video, in fact, addresses hearing parents of deaf children. Annabelle Sherry is a deaf mother of 2 hearing children who frequently posts to the internet videos, photos, and short essays which provide intimate details of how she navigates sensory asymmetries between herself and her children. These posts are part of a larger activist project aimed at ensuring that deaf children in Malta are provided access to LSM. Today, in a discussion informed by a series of long and short-term ethnographic trips I've taken to Malta between 2010 and 2019, and through which I've become a competent LSM signer, I'll situate Sherry's project in the particularities of the broader moment in which her activism is unfolding. In so doing, I followed the example set by Leila Monaghan, whose work called for and evinced nuanced attention to how broader historical contexts shaped and are shaped by deaf social and linguistic practices. I'll also follow Monaghan in attending to the roles that deaf and hearing scholarship and scholarly institutions have played and may continue to play in these processes, concluding with attention to the Society for Linguistic Anthropology's potential roles, ultimately arguing that building an SLA that centers deaf perspectives can and should be a part of how we honor Leila's legacy. The heading of this next slide, Signs of Their Times, of course refers to a seminal annual review of anthropology article co-authored by Monaghan and panel participant Richard Senghas in 2002. In that piece, the 2 scholars presented an overview of then current studies of deafness and sign languages, establishing for many in our field an understanding of a mode of language and sociality that had been theretofore largely sidelined in linguistic anthropological work. During the period covered by this article, in many ethnographic contexts, hearing families, publics, states, and other institutions often ascribe to negative language ideologies about the nature of sign languages, frequently not recognizing them as fully linguistic or only beginning to do so, And this was indeed the case in Malta at about the time this article came out. Such beliefs often resulted in oralist policies which prioritized speech and disparaged sign language use. Despite those beliefs, across many contexts, deaf social networks grounded in institutions like residential schools for deaf students and deaf social clubs afforded the linguistic and social reproduction of sign languages and deaf cultural capacities, even in the face of conditions, to quote Paris and Alim, that aimed to diminish them. A significant shift has occurred in many of these contexts in the 20 years since the article was written. Through changes in both scholarly claims about the nature of sign languages and concerted deaf activism, categories which of course overlap in important ways, in many contexts, hearing public's ideologies about sign languages have become much more positive, with their status as linguistic increasingly taken for granted, even as a range of misconceptions persist. Concurrently, more hearing people have been adding signing to their linguistic repertoires through college courses, online materials, aforementioned baby sign materials, etc. Indeed, for example, LSM courses have become hugely popular at the University of Malta. However, as this cartoon shown by Maureen Klusa, which features a deaf baby's hands immobilized in handcuffs as they observe a hearing baby gleefully signing suggests, a double standard, perhaps a hearing private space in some ways akin to Hill's white public space, is in operation. Over 95% of deaf children have hearing parents, and such parents continue to overwhelmingly be encouraged by medical specialists and speech therapists to augment their children's hearing with aids or cochlear implantation and to discourage the use of sign languages due to the false but persistent belief that signing will hamper development of spoken language. With the practice of mainstreaming or enrolling deaf children into schools for hearing students with no deaf peers, eroding previous institutional centers of sign language reproduction in many contexts, de Mulder notes that, quote, "It is likely there are now more hearing than deaf children who adopt a sign language in their linguistic repertoires." Bauman and Murray describe this moment for sign languages as one of parallel dissemination and decimation. These demographic shifts in signing access relate to shifts in academic framing of sign languages. During the period in which Signs of Their Times was written, the scholarly project of, quote, solidifying the legitimacy of sign languages entailed demonstrating their boundedness from spoken languages and from one another. For example, members of the Deaf People's Association of Malta, or DPAM, here pictured, in partnership with linguists from the University of Malta, have worked to produce the kinds of textual objects, such as dictionaries, through which the ideological objectification of languages as distinct from one another is grounded. This strategy has led to important gains, including the 2016 Maltese parliamentary approval of a bill declaring LSM an official Maltese language. And the image here is of members of the Deaf Association posing with a linguist from the university on the night that the bill was passed. And we all went out for shots afterwards. It was a really nice time to be in town. More recently, however, a great deal of scholarship has focused on contesting the notion of languages as bounded, instead attending to what is sometimes called translanguaging, or, quote, the deployment of a speaker's full linguistic repertoire without regard for watchful adherence to socially and politically defined boundaries of named languages. And here I'm quoting from Othagai, Garcia, and Reed. A shift to a translanguaging perspective is in many ways a reaction to how framings of language that posit or idealize firm boundaries between codes and modalities can reflect and reproduce social hierarchies and inequalities. However, blurring boundaries between codes and modalities does not in and of itself lead to greater understanding of linguistic complexities or redress discriminatory dynamics and structures. For example, critics of a translanguaging perspective have noted that seeing all multimodal communication as equally accessible or emancipating overlooks sensorial asymmetries and differential access to semiotic resources, may threaten, quote, the vitality and maintenance of sign languages as minority languages, and may legitimate practices that are deemed accessible to deaf people, but in reality are only partially accessible, such as, for example, pedagogical practices that involve limited use of lexical signs mapped onto spoken language grammars. And here I've been quoting from de Mulder et al. And I'll note that I've seen this in Nepal as well, certainly in terms of how these ideologies contribute to pedagogical practices in Nepali deaf schools as well. So to return to the above discussion of the increase in hearing signers, many of them in fact don't learn sign languages as a whole, by which here I mean linguistic practices as modeled by fluent deaf signers, but rather learn a collection of lexical signs that they laminate onto speech. And such use of resources without, again, to return to the definition of translanguaging, regard for watchful adherence to socially and politically defined boundaries of named languages, can in practice further contribute to the decimation via dissemination that some critics fear may counterintuitively result from hearing people's increasing ideological valorization of and use of sign languages. That said, deaf scholars and activists also note potential value in a shift away from legitimating sign languages by framing them as bounded off from spoken languages, from one another, and from other semiotic resources, as Anne also just mentioned. These include a more nuanced and inclusive account of the full range of deaf communicative practices that are not always well captured by national sign language labels, and a sense that hearing families and publics may often imagine deaf and hearing worlds as separate and impenetrable, an ideological frame that may contribute to hearing parents withholding sign language access from deaf children, a fear that may be ameliorated by a translanguaging-oriented perspective. Indeed, while activism and research defending LSM's status as a distinct language has been effective at changing written policy in Malta, in practice, hearing parents of deaf children have continued to overwhelmingly choose to eschew signing in favor of speech training. And this is the dynamic that Annabelle Sherry seeks to interrupt. So Annabelle offers some background about herself in the following video, which I'll just briefly play.
I was born hearing, and when I was 6 years old, my hearing became deaf when I had a viral infection. I never learned how to sign. Accessibility was always a problem because I could never understand what was being said. Then when I met the deaf people from Malta who could use sign language, I felt for the first time that I belonged.
So Sherry, as she notes, Sherry had 6 years of language acquisition as a hearing child under her belt before she became deaf, and thus a relatively strong base of sensorially accessible spoken language acquisition relative to children born deaf. Her spoken language production skills reflect that. But as she explained to me over coffee in 2016, she nevertheless often struggled to understand instruction in school and struggled even more with following her peers' speech, especially in multi-party interactions, which pose a major challenge for even the most successful lip readers. Being able to fully understand and participate in group events in a relaxing, accessible way once she met deaf signers and learned LSM was a major component of her, quote, conversion, as Bechter would put it, to sign language use. And since making this deaf turn, as Friedner would put it, Sherry has sought to help deaf Maltese children have this experience at an earlier age than she was afforded. Sign language access for deaf children is indeed an urgent social justice issue, as panel participant Ann Pfister and I argue in a forthcoming book chapter. As, quote, oralist ideologies put deaf people at risk of experiencing, and here I'm quoting Murray, persistent lack of unhindered access to natural language during the critical period for language acquisition, an experience often termed language deprivation. And this label is applied to both the circumstances in which accessible language input is unavailable to a child and the potential consequences of such deprivation, which can measurably impair a child's acquisition of and proficiency in languages they're exposed to subsequently, with adverse consequences in other developmental domains that depend on language. And again, quoting from Murray there. Attempting to prevent such deprivation entails addressing hearing parents of deaf children. So I'm going to return to the orange juice video with which we opened. My apologies, but due to time, I'll just briefly paraphrase rather than read in full Sherry's caption for the video. She notes that earlier in the day, Emily had used the sign orange for the first time, and consequently, Sherry had not had to ask Emily to repeat her quest for clarification, as she often needed to when Emily spoke. Sherry then explicitly ties that experience to the ways in which sign language use would help deaf children likewise more easily understand their hearing families, and concludes by contesting the inaccurate framing of sign language use as a hindrance to speech acquisition. In the accompanying video that we saw at the beginning of the talk, Sherry addressed her hearing daughter orally, perhaps in so doing reassuring hearing parents that spoken Maltese and LSM competence are not mutually exclusive. At the same time, the text she provides to frame the clips stress the sensory asymmetry between herself and her child, which Emily had responded to in using the sign for orange. Similarly, in this post, featuring an image of Sherry holding Emily with the latter's head buried in her neck, which I'll also paraphrase for time, Sherry describes how when Emily's upset and insists on being held in such a position, that Sherry encourages her to respond to yes or no inquiries about what's upsetting her with nods and head shakes. A point of overlap between LSM and spoken Maltese co-speech gestures, which Sherry can perceive through tactile sensation when Emily's face and hands aren't visually accessible as articulators. This is another instance in which Sherry stresses the sensory asymmetries between hearing and deaf parents and children, and highlights the ways in which family members can seek sensory and linguistic common ground as a form of moral orientation, to quote Green, toward making meaning together. Such posts showcase Sherry and her daughter drawing on their linguistic repertoires without, quote, regard to the watchful adherence to socially and politically defined boundaries of named languages, but with watchful consideration of their sensory asymmetries. In isolation, however, such posts could potentially present a vision of signing as little more than a way to supplement speech. Consequently, when Sherry addresses the camera in her posts, she typically does so in LSM, as seen here. So I'll just play just a brief, not for content, but just for the form. I'll just pause it. So as she does here in LSM with English and Maltese subtitles, allowing her to both address a range of audiences and to reinforce an understanding of LSM as a distinct language, commensurate with but not reducible to speech. And I'll note that while she performs mouthings that visually resemble those involved in speaking Maltese here, she's not laminating LSM signs onto a Maltese syntactic structure, but using the distinct spatial grammar of LSM. In sum, across these videos, Sherry eschews languaging practices with a history of contributing to power disparities based on one's amount of hearing ability, without seeking to, quote, adhere to a form of linguistic separatism or purism that doesn't fit the lived realities of deaf lives, which involve interaction with multiple semiotic codes and linguistic competencies across the lifespan. And in making this characterization, I'm again quoting from de Mulder et al. So to conclude, the language socialization literature in linguistic anthropology seeks to challenge, as Zentea puts it, policies that encourage and enforce subjugation, and oralist policies regarding deaf children should be included among those we actively seek to challenge. While we may often feel that our work fails to reach broader publics and be consequential in the quote world, the close relationship between scholarship about sign languages, deaf activism, social and educational policies, and broader public's language ideologies about sign languages make it clear that such scholarship can be highly consequential for deaf people's lived experiences. Indeed, for example, de Mulder et al. Cautions scholars who adopt a translanguaging perspective in their analyses to be clear that they are describing but not prescribing such practices, out of the very reasonable fear that such scholarship could be mobilized to validate policies which would hold full sign language exposure from deaf children. At the same time, of course, deaf activists such as Annabelle Sherry do attempt to prescribe to hearing parents the vital importance of providing deaf children access to accessible sign language use. An important path toward redressing the injustice of language deprivation of deaf children is to encourage hearing parents of deaf children to recognize that, I'm quoting from my chapter with Anne, the specialized knowledge and authority of deaf people who've experienced language deprivation and who advocate for sign language use. The Society of Linguistic Anthropology can and should support such efforts and is well positioned to do so, given that our ethnographic methods afford the centering of perspectives of deaf children and adults, which are often absent in the materials provided to hearing parents of deaf children. And we can see in Leila Monaghan's scholarship, of course, an excellent example of this kind of work. At the same time, the SLA needs to make our subfield more welcoming to deaf scholars whose perspectives and access needs are not consistently recognized in our institutions and practices. There are a range of ways in which these dynamics can be redressed, but due to time, I'll just mention one here. SLA as a whole, rather than just individual members, for example, should consider working closely with the Disability Research Interest Group, DRIG, on their continuing efforts to make meetings such as the AAA more accessible, efforts which have been ongoing but are certainly not yet adequate. Because of course, these issues of accessibility at conferences often center on language access, and language is our thing, right? So I suggest that such efforts would be one appropriate way to honor Leila's legacy. Thank you very much. And our next speaker will be speaking through a pre-recorded talk, which I will now load and advance for us. Okay, so the next talk is titled, Okay, so the next talk is titled Hand in Hand, Cripps Access Intimacies in Linguistics by Octavian E. Rodinson at Gallaudet University.
Hello. Very sorry I couldn't be there with the panel today. Unfortunately, I had a flight delay and was unable to be there, so I had to make this recording. Now, the title of this research, Hand in Hand, wants to look at disability access and how it relates to language. A lot of this is based on my work with Dr. Jonathan Henner, who you can see in this image next to me. He is a white presenting male with brown, short, curly hair and a plaid shirt. He's currently a professor at the University of North Carolina, Greensboro. He has done a lot of work in the field of language acquisition, in terms of deaf children and other disabled children. Our work has culminated over 5 years of publishing numerous articles related to attitudes towards language and education, attitudes towards sign language research, attitudes towards deaf people in education and academia as both subjects, participants, researchers, and scholars. We look at language environments and consider fields like linguistics and deaf studies and education and how they interact. At the end of this slide deck, I'll show you all the references that you'll be able to work off of from this presentation. Now, Dr. Henner and I both look at cryptlinguistics as a frame of thinking, as a way of studying language through a framework of critical and active disability politics and how it intersects with academia. I want to very briefly discuss this critical disability framework and lens. It's important that we prioritize this in our thinking. There is no such thing as a broken language or as disordered language. There's no such thing. All language, all modalities, whether they're used to express, whether it be signed, spoken, written, gestures, pointing, or any other mode of communication, all of these are an expression of language. We look at how we present a message through this critical disability framework that shows clearly the intersectionality of disability groups, be it race, gender, sexuality. All of these build a disability world as a whole. So when we think about and talk about how we frame and understand language and how that contributes to our understanding of people as we categorize them in these different categories that are based on this system of oppression and hierarchical thinking. So when we think about how we can use this disability perspective and not marginalize them, but center them, when we think about their perspective on language and how they themselves use the language to express thought and how we think about them. Who disabled people are in terms of your academia, your research, and your knowledge. Not just as a subject, but as an expert. When we analyze language, we have to remember that when we see something and we say something is broken or no good, or a language is disordered, we are the problem. We reject the premise of a broken language or disordered language. It would be the same as looking down on someone for their accent, dialect, language use, modality, whether it be gestures or somebody who is to be considered languageless, or a language that doesn't have a written system. All of these deficit ways of thinking, of looking at somebody as less intelligent, as less capable, as less than equal of being able to express themselves, being able to contribute, to being able to partake in political discussion and express their point of view, when that is discounted, that is a problem. We value and include disabled people and their use of language, because that shows what the human brain is capable of, that it's not impaired or different, but it can in fact hack the world. It can create technology. It can use adaptive technology to the environment around them, and it can make people around them fit to them. So we reclaim this space and we reclaim this world so that disabled people aren't just passive recipients while the world around us decides and comes up with solutions or creations or analyzes us into something that's not true. We value disabled people and the way they use language, and at the same time, we reject this deficit thinking of language and the attitude towards languages and beliefs and ideologies. Crip linguistics emphasizes this critical thinking and the valuing of all disabled people and people using language. In our earlier work from 2017 and 2018, our biggest question, and question that we still ask today, is where are the deaf educators? Where are the deaf scholars that are involved in the teaching of sign language and sign language research? Where are the deaf interpreter trainers in the interpreter training programs? Where are the deaf linguists? Where are the anthropologists that are deaf and studying sign languages? Where are deaf folks that are using critical disability frameworks in linguistics as well as other fields? If it's not only us asking this question, there are many deaf folks in a number of fields, whether it be sign language education, interpreter training, sign language linguistics, or anthropology. All of these professionals are constantly asking, where are the deaf people? Where are the people with disabilities? Where are the folks where the research, where it's about us and our language and our place in the world? Where are we? Right? So that brings in another layer of thinking. When we look at sign language linguistics and the research thereof, it is usually dominated by the majority, right? And it doesn't recognize these different intersectionalities and these different ways of being in sign language communities. And we often overlook this. For example, Lynn Hu, Joseph Hill, Dominic Hiriason. These are some folks that were mentioned 2 years ago, at a high-level linguistics society at the University of New Mexico. This is a big issue in sign language research. Right? There's all of these perspectives, and there's a lot of debate about the language, and linguists constantly debate it, but it's still very much at a superficial level. It's still very much steeped in whiteness. Disability studies, deaf studies, very much steeped in whiteness in their respective fields. So we need to ask, where are the other deaf scholars? Where are these, we need to constantly ask the question, where are deaf faculty members? Where are deaf scholars? Where are deaf people in linguistics programs all over the country? Where are the deaf tenure track faculty members that teach American Sign Language? Or tenure track anthropology professors? You may have one position related to sign language research, but where are the deaf professionals? We see UC Santa Barbara, University of New Mexico, Gallaudet. But when you look at other institutions, we don't see deaf professionals, but we see a huge explosion of popularity in sign language. Many universities see ASL as a cash cow, but do not hire deaf individuals to teach them. Do not hire deaf individuals to lead their interpreter training or their ASL programs or to research the languages. They're not hiring deaf folks. Crip linguistics centers the deaf and disabled experience, their knowledge, their language, and their work when it comes to sign language. We value the individuals who are deaf and look at these languages through a critical disability lens. They provide such an important perspective for both the field of sign language linguistics and the field of general linguistics, as well as a number of other fields of study. What we apply here doesn't just stay here. It can fit the rest of the world. We can apply it in a number of different opportunities and settings. So when we think about modalities, when we think about interactive relationships, when we think about standing and how we think about language and what we see and what we hear and what we find, if we can expand our thinking just a little as to what language actually is about, not just in the classroom, but also in the lab, both are equally important. How do we bring in that disabled way of being, right? How do we encourage disabled folks to share their knowledge about how they use language in the community as well as an individual user? When we think about the topic today, we think about this idea of extractive allyship, exploiting deaf individuals, researchers, scholars, and activists. Joseph Murray, a linguistic anthropologist, and Annalise Custers, sent out a number of tweets about a number of issues that face deaf individuals that are involved in the field of sign language linguistics and the research of signed languages, as well as anthropology and a number of fields of study in regards to deaf people that are exploited. Oftentimes, we are invited to the table as a panelist and in the token deaf representative. I'm on a sign language panel about allyship, about sign language research, and we want allies in the community, but how many deaf folks are involved in the panel, right? You know, when we talk about research and collaborating with deaf folks in research, whether they be a research assistant or a small role, you know, but not taking the time to get them long-term into research, to get them working on long-term publications, big grants, right? If we're working hand in hand as hearing and deaf sign language researchers, that's not a victory, right? That should be the standard. That should be the status quo, right? So a lot of deaf academics are asking sign language linguists and researchers and anthropologists how to get deaf folks more access to those spaces, dialogues, as well as opportunities for deaf academics to be involved about conversations about us, our community, and our languages, to allow us to be involved in the work and not just a token as one person, as one deaf person in our collection, right? One deaf person on our research team, one deaf person on our panel, one deaf guest presenter who we've paid a little bit to come talk to us about their expertise, but not taking the time to invest in this academic, in their opportunities, in their career going forward. Yeah, that's should be the minimal expectation.
Okay, good morning. Thank you for being here or wherever. My name is Richard Senghas, and my presentation here is called Indigenous Language, Ethno-Linguistic Identity or Disability, Nicaraguan Sign Language, Deaf Education, and Ideologies of Inclusion and Accessibility. I'm so pleased to be following Octavian because he expresses an awful lot of the issues that have been of concern for me for decades now. And I'll get to that in my discussion about positionality. So what I want to be focusing on here is that sign language has raised and brought to the front several different kinds of ideologies in Nicaragua. For those who aren't familiar with this particular case, we've documented it elsewhere. Laura Polich has a whole book on the case study, and I and my sister and some others have been putting articles out there. One chapter, In Many Ways to Be Deaf, which Leila Monaghan was a lead editor on. I have a chapter in there that talks about the history. But what I've been seeing is that there's constantly this tension, sometimes overlapping, with the use of these ideologies. And they are whether the language is being recognized as an indigenous language of Nicaragua. And so it's a political kind of issue that reaches into the hearing language ideologies about other languages of Nicaragua. There's also the issue of ethno-linguistic identity and its manifestations in different kinds of societies. Oh, sorry, I forgot to put on my timer to keep me from running on. Okay, and then the issue of deafness as disability. So what I've been seeing over, I guess, 3 decades now in Nicaragua is that there's been a strategic and sometimes tactical deployment of these ideologies. And so different parties at different times to advance or challenge various interests will be using these. So addressing positionality, I'm a late learner of sign language. I came into it in my 30s when I decided to return back to academia. And that was in the 1990s. And so, of course, as somebody who was going to be doing field work in sign language, I had to learn about sign language linguistics, and ASL was dominating the linguistic literature. But also at that time, we were seeing that, Padman Humphreys and some other folks' model of cultural deafness was really being promoted in opposition to a pathological or medical model. And so that was in the air as I was taking my ASL classes at Rochester. And I was taught by a deaf graduate student in the cognitive science program at Rochester who was in their ASL program, Leslie Greer. And she gave me my sign name. So I also ended up in the field learning some of the Nicaraguan sign language. Idioma de Señas de Nicaragua is the way the deaf folks down there have named it in their dictionary. And then I also learned some Swedish Sign Language when I was doing some field work in Sweden because the Swedes had been working in Nicaragua. So there was some contact issues going on there. But I'm a hearing researcher, obviously, right? And we have had some CODA scholars working with us, Jenny Pyers and Erika along the way. But we've had very limited opportunity to have deaf scholars. A few have come down often for comparative experiences, but not really getting solidly entrenched in the project. Our work has been informed by cognitive sciences, language acquisition, especially child language acquisition. I also, when I was at Rochester, was trained in social anthrotheory, and I'll get to that a little bit later as to why I think that view, rather than a cultural anthropology view, has flavored the way I've looked at this case. All right. So it's also important to think about the North-South issues going on. We see Sweden, we see lots of North American, a handful of European scholars working in Nicaragua, which is in Central America. We don't see folks coming from Central America doing as much of the studies there. And that's in part because education has been limited for deaf folks in Nicaragua. So going back to the 70s and 80s, when we had the revolution in Nicaragua, the Revolutionary Party, the FSLN, sought support from some of the various different linguistic communities, especially in eastern Nicaragua. I'll put up a map in a moment. And they were having trouble in general getting support from the folks on the Atlantic coast. And so in order to garner some of their support and solidarity, they assured that there would be recognition and support for the indigenous heritage languages there. So for instance, Rama, Sumu, Mosquito, and all the contact phenomena that we had between those languages and the colonial languages coming in. And those areas are now referred to as Oran and Ras autonomous regions. And these languages were eventually protected in the Constitution after the revision of the Constitution under the Sandinista regime. So CIDCA, which was a Center for Documentation and Research on the Atlantic Coast, was tasked with the idea of documenting these languages. And that was in part to fulfill that constitutional commitment to support. So that organization had strong connections to MIT. And so folks like Ken Hale and others came down, and among them was Judy Kegel in the 80s, who was the first one to come down and look at the sign language formally, and ended up realizing, hey, we got something interesting going on here. And so she was in tune with this constitutional defense for these languages, and I think was possibly an avenue of introducing this idea of defend your language as a Nicaraguan language, because in this very pro-patriotic kind of venue, following the embargo with the US and other kinds of places, this idea of it being us Nicaragua against other people who are denying power really was kind of salient and was picked up that way. We even see in a BBC Horizon documentary that was directed by Judith Munting back in '97, we see Javier Lopez Gomez saying, this is pure Nicaraguan, like he was talking with pride about this language. And so clearly we've got that ideological component coming in. So here's just a map if you're not familiar with how Nicaragua is laid out. And you'll see basically splitting where the word Nicaragua is, going north to south, is a mountain range. And so the Atlantic coast side is very different. And it's telling that the folks from Managua, the capital, which you see with the little red star, will refer to it as the Atlantic coast. Even the name of that organization is called that. And yet when I was over in Bluefields, they consider themselves Caribbean. And I think that's a key identity difference. So in this climate of having these indigenous languages being supported, we ended up noticing that there was a problematic association when Nicaraguan Sign Language was referred to as indígena, because that term brought up associations and conflations with the term primitiva. And we've seen this before, where the erasure of sign language as being real language, even though there's plenty of evidence to the contrary, and now it's been formally documented. We also see that this raised the bugaboo of creolization and pidginization and all those ideological concerns, which we heard Michel de Graaf revisiting again last night too. And I'm glad to see him here. And so this was at play too. And so how this played out, I saw sometimes in workshops and presentations that were done either by the Ministry of Education or Los Pepitos, which is a nonprofit that was meant to be assistance for originally parents of kids with disabilities. We see this influential audiologist, Natalia Popova, who had been trained in Russia and was strongly oralist. She used this idea of, oh, if it's indigenous, then it's primitive, and therefore we really shouldn't be teaching the kids this sign language stuff. They should be using Spanish and lip reading, because that stuff is just mimigas, mine. That whole translanguaging thing, right? So we have that in there. And so what we see, though, at that time, remember this is the 90s, we're starting to see this framing of, well, if deaf folks are recognized as having a language, because it was harder for them, I guess, to think of having language, right? But if they have a language, then that leads to the idea that they must have a culture that goes with the language, because we see this ideology frequently. And I think this is part of why Patton and Humphrey's deaf culture model, and they were just among others, but why their cultural model was really ringing, because even here in the States, we've had a strong essentialist view of deaf folks in implicit ideologies. And so that was capturing. And we saw this getting picked up by the educators down in Nicaragua. And so with Nicaraguan Sign Language being analyzed by all these trained linguists from prestigious places, oh, there's something here. And then when we compare that with, remember the Deaf Way movement, right? We saw people coming in the late 80s for that whole Deaf Way event after following the Deaf Press now at Gallaudet. Suddenly there were all these accounts of sign language all over the world. And so that helped also get this idea that, oh, there's always many different languages, and hence the volume that Leila Monaghan and the rest of us worked on. Many ways to be deaf was our way of saying we're a little problematic with that essential one way of thinking of deaf culture. But anyway, this model was used to counter a very locally entrenched model of deafness that was similar to our medical and pathological one, but it was a little different. Polish, I'll get to that later. So I do think that, for instance, Patty Ladd and others that have been cited here, deafhood, deafnicity that we see coming from Eckert, Friedner's deaf sociality, these have been often discussed challenging the language equal culture model. But one of the poor things that happens is, as we argue and maybe even focus on this critically, we end up falling into George Lakoff's trap. Don't think of an elephant. If we keep repeating that the deaf culture is essentialized and all the rest of it, what do people remember? Oh, there's an essential deaf culture, right? Anyway, so this was a conversation. I remember Laura Polich and I in the 90s, I was finishing a Fulbright fellowship down there. She was beginning one. And we had this conversation during part of our overlap. And she was really concerned about how she was seeing in the literature describing deaf cultures in different places, including in Nicaragua, this American deaf culture, because she saw, it's different down here. And so she ended up developing this eternal child dependent model, which was the sort of problematic one, and then the potential remedial subject, or the remediatable subject, so that when they got language, things could happen. And I was arguing at the time, not articulately enough, and many, especially deaf scholars, have argued this much better since, but that we're going to have different kinds of local manifestations. Translanguaging and all these things are actually a social issue where we're using cultural domain of phenomena, but really what we have to be looking at is what's emergent at the time, the interactions. And so that's why I've liked Friedner's deaf sociality. And then I know I'm running out of time here, so I'll go a little faster through this. But we do see that there's this conundrum. When you're in a developing or a colonized, extracted country like Nicaragua that has been wrestling with being down in the most economically problematic range, along with Haiti and some other places that because of external colonial forces have really left them without the ability to do what we get to do elsewhere. They are looking for international aid constantly. And one of the places that they've been successful is if deafness continues to be framed as a disability, a lot more money comes in, right? Whether it's coming from the UN or other kinds of international organizations. And so they're having to, in a sense, play this disability card because they're desperate, right? They really need these resources, yet it's more complicated than that. And so we also see a bit of this zero-sum game thing where there's a antagonism amongst some of the folks, in part because of the limited resources. There have been times of great successful collaboration, but more often than not, the way the deck's stacked, they have to be competing with each other. So currently what we're seeing is that deaf children have increasingly been getting education. That is a big change from the 70s and earlier, but the majority are still being taught by hearing teachers, most with only limited signing. Interpreters are occasionally being used in secondary education, sometimes at the university level too. But even though we have deaf adults getting full certification through the university, they're not being hired. And an ideology around the worry about, will these deaf kids learn how to read and write Spanish from somebody who's deaf? How could that happen? That becomes a barrier. And then when they are hired by the schools, they're inevitably in subordinate positions to hearing folks who often don't sign. However, we are seeing some positive things. Marie Coppola has been doing outreach to parents of deaf children, trying to do, in a way, similar to what we were seeing in the Malta case of, if we can get in, the hearing parents can do enough with sign to produce a richer and better environment for their young children. And so I've raised these issues of indigenous language ideologies, ethno-linguistic identity issues, disabilities, and while deaf sociality and these other kinds of models are so much more productive in some ways, we are going to see these three essentializing ideologies continue, is my prediction, because they've been useful politically, sometimes, oops, my apologies, sometimes with negative unintended consequences, but often with the intended consequences. And so that will keep perpetuating. Doesn't mean we should keep working on it, making it richer. Thank you.
Morning, everyone, and thank you for coming out this early. I've changed my title a little bit for reasons I'll explain, and I'll admit that it's probably still not entirely accurate. Is it just not? Okay. All right, thank you. But I've changed it to Ukrainian Sign Language and Semiotics of Belonging. And I'm Jay Dickinson from the University of Vermont. So today is day 43 of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Like all wars, this one has brought out the best and worst in people and communities, including the Ukrainian deaf community and its allies. But right now, I think mostly the best. While it seems ridiculous to say that war is a grand disruptor event, that is what I've been grappling with this past month, trying to make the pieces of this paper fit together again. When I wrote my abstract about 1 million years ago, I had planned to write about what I saw as a trajectory for some in the Ukrainian deaf community towards specific goals of political recognition that they considered essential precursors to deaf inclusion in the Ukrainian state building project. So I'm going to start with that, and we'll see where this goes. This panel celebrates Leila Monaghan's formative impact on deaf studies and the linguistic anthropology of deaf communities. Touching on themes in her scholarship, there are so many that connect to what I want to say here, including trying to examine radical shifts in deaf sociality over time, deaf political engagement and empowerment, and the untangling of hegemonic discourses that define center and margin in colonized spaces. But let me begin with the post-Soviet, but still Soviet 2013. That's what you see in this photograph here, the 80th anniversary celebration of the founding of UTO, the Ukrainian Society for the Deaf, complete with performances of Ukrainian dancing, speeches from visiting presidents of other former Soviet bloc societies for the deaf, and concluding in an enormous vodka-fueled banquet. You notice there's no photographs of that, at a vacation hotel property owned by the society near the Kyiv suburb of Hostomel, which you may know was recently recaptured by Ukrainian forces and has essentially been completely leveled. As someone new to working with the Ukrainian deaf community, but with 20 years at that time of research in the former Soviet Union, the incredible Sovietness of it all, including the performance of very Soviet notions of deaf identity and of Ukrainian identity, was striking to me. Celebration of the beauty of sign language, but with an emphasis on signing Ukrainian songs and poems. Interpretation using sign or calqued Ukrainian of the speech of the 25-year president of the organization, who was hard of hearing, but himself did not sign. Although I did not know it then, this was like a huge party marking the end of this way of being deaf. And here are some examples. You'll notice that many of the performers here are of an older generation. No, of course, this has not disappeared, but a series of changes, including the appointment of the first in 80 years, deaf president of the Ukrainian Society for the Deaf, and the transformative use of technology to connect to information and to each other during the Maidan protests in Kiev in 2014 signaled dramatic change and movement. Here are Oleksiy and Rostislav, an architect and an actor, deaf activists, deaf Olympians, acting as citizen reporters during the Maidan protests, recording and streaming reports from the site. This was a transformative moment of deaf engagement in politics of the nation and not politics of deaf inclusion in the nation. There were deaf individuals who were involved in the protests in various ways, including these two as well, as a deaf Olympian, a judo silver medalist who was killed. He was one of the 108 people who were killed that are called the Heavenly 100. Technologies like live streaming through cell phones, news feeds on TV, so the addition of that running text stream at the bottom of the television, social media, the availability of video calls to every person who owned a phone, all of these things were transformative in 2014. They marked a different way of being deaf and a different way of being Ukrainian that was dramatically different from what we saw in that 80th anniversary celebration. This is Natalia Borisovna Adamyuk. She is a PhD linguist, the first deaf Ukrainian to receive a PhD, and she's the head of the Ukrainian Sign Language Laboratory. Under her leadership, the laboratory, and in collaboration with scholars, including many Canadian and North American scholars, they have worked for over the years to promote USL, Ukrainian Sign Language standardization and recognition. They've been very influenced by deaf activists in North America and Europe. They have a strong emphasis on contemporary ideas about deaf language, community, and deaf rights, but they also, and I've noticed this much more in recent years, are emphasizing the Ukrainian context. For example, in rejecting the word pluhei or deaf and choosing other words to represent the community. And one of the things I want to note here, because it's important, and I wish I could have written my whole paper on this, part of this has been a promotion of Ukrainian Sign Language as different from Russian Sign Language, and the complicated ways in which that's related to the voicing of Ukrainian Sign Language by interpreters in Ukrainian instead of in Russian. So in fact, the spoken language becomes the semiotic signal that the underlying sign language is different, as opposed to examination of the two sign languages in comparison. Through the school system, one of the things that we've seen is an increasing development of deaf Ukrainian identity that has continued to mirror the centralization of Ukrainian language in the entire school system, and the growth or development of a civic identity marked by aspects of ethnic identity, like, as you can see here, costume, as they recite a poem and sign simultaneously. The man in this scenario he's deaf, and he's a teacher at the school, and the woman on the right is a hearing coda. Like the push for the official recognition of Ukrainian Sign Language, the push for rights to USL education has also been ongoing. USL was only allowed to be taught in Ukrainian schools starting in 2012 or so. It's very oralist, as Richard already mentioned, very oralist ideological paradigm in this part of the world. This includes recent pushbacks against attempts to close deaf boarding schools and to mainstream deaf children with minimal interpreter and academic support. So that actually mobilized, this entire deaf school mobilized a protest and strike in a protest against the appointment of a school director who intended to make it a special school that did not include deaf children and to mainstream the deaf children. I also want to note the increasing inclusion of lay interpreters, both hearing and deaf. And this woman here is a deaf lay interpreter in different ways in church settings in which religious identity in different denominations has become part of a developing Ukrainian identity, including teaching children how to say the Lord's Prayer in Ukrainian Sign Language and so forth. Oops. Is that it? Okay. I don't know why that's happening. I apologize for that. And so it's important to note that church gatherings like these have largely displaced the Deaf Cultural Club as settings for regular deaf sociality. So there would regularly be 40 or 50 at this deaf-oriented sign language service once a week. That is in addition to about 20 or 30 who would attend a nearby interpreted service that was mainly for hearing parishioners at a different church. Whereas the Deaf Club, if they held any events at all, you might get 10 older Ukrainians showing up. At the start, I said that it is day 43 of the Russian invasion, but in fact, as many of you know, this conflict has been ongoing in Ukraine since 2014. There have been a slow and steady trickle of military losses, and during that time, one of the elements that's been paid attention to in Ukrainian culture is PTSD among Ukrainian soldiers who have returned from the front in Eastern Ukraine. And so this was an event that I went to. A local veterans organization had done some theater therapy, I guess you would call it, where soldiers and veterans were creating plays. And so this was a play that was written about a mental facility that was supporting soldiers with PTSD. And they came and they gave a performance for the deaf community with interpretation by one of the local interpreters. And these are the kinds of things that would reach out and connect deaf Ukrainians into an ongoing development of Ukrainian identity. I don't know why this, okay. Yeah, I don't know if I'm like, I don't know if it's wiggling or what, but it's not showing up. I'll try and simultaneously lean into the microphone and stay away from the cord. All right. So part and parcel of this was, rather limited access to interpreted television news and other news sources. So one of the things that happened in 2019 as a run-up to the presidential elections was that a television station that largely supported Petro Poroshenko, the defending incumbent in the position, launched actually 24/7 interpretation services as part of its news programming. So it's an alt news channel. And I actually heard from one of the interpreters that this older deaf woman called her up and said, "It's amazing. I can't sleep. There's someone who wants to talk to me. This is the first time in my life that people on the TV have wanted to talk to me." So she could get up at any time of the night and there would be someone signing for her on the television. And that was such a transformative experience of inclusion that she struggled to sleep because she just wanted to stay and watch the interpretation. Okay. Also in 2019, a controversial law on the functioning of Ukrainian as the state language was passed. Almost all of the controversy focused on the provisions that were seen as aiming at curtailing the use of Russian language in Ukraine. However, it included a whole article as well as other references to Ukrainian Sign Language, defining Ukrainian Sign Language as the language of sign language users on the territory of Ukraine. It clarifies that the law on language does not curtail in any way the rights to use sign language, so creates sign language as the signed equivalent to Ukrainian as an official status within the state. And it asserts that the development of USL as one of the primary means of communication for sign language users is a means of supporting Ukrainian spoken language in its role as the official language of Ukraine. I did find some Russian newspaper reactions to this, which included a number of articles about seeking to ban Russian sign language, which seems rather odd. These were not in deaf-oriented publications, but one of the statistics that was noted is that Armenian Sign Language uses 24% of its own signs. And Azerbaijani Sign Language uses 13% of its own signs, but Ukrainian Sign Language only uses 2% unique signs when compared to Russian Sign Language. And the article argued that this is in fact not Ukrainian Sign Language, but rather Soviet Sign Language, and therefore was unified across all of the Soviet Union. The last paragraph of the article actually has nothing to do with sign language at all. It's about a recent removal of Russian as a special language within a particular region of Ukraine. So again, conflating politics around sign languages with the politics around the use of the spoken languages with which they're linked. After the start of the war, there was this brief lag, and I think as we're starting to have people present their personal stories of the war, including deaf people, you're seeing that for many of them, these first few days, not knowing what was going on, being unable to hear sirens, feeling the results of bombings or shootings, but not being able to discern necessarily what was going on was extremely traumatic, particularly for deaf people. There was also a lot of confusion about rules surrounding opportunities to leave Ukraine as a refugee. But very quickly, interpreters collaborated with the Society for the Deaf and got Telegram channels up and running with tons and tons of interpretation and information that is presented in live streams to people. So here, this is Natalia Kravtsova, who is a sign language interpreter, and she does all the official interpretation of Zelensky's speeches. This is something brand new. It just came up last week. Oleksiy, who you saw is one of the citizen reporters, was part of a group that launched a new website, and it's called Hanba Deaf or Deaf Shame. And it calls out and posts information about who are spreading disinformation about the war. So it's a really interesting of activities are going on in hearing spaces. The last thing I want to talk about briefly is my friend. When I saw her in, I think this was in 2017, and she's really refused to live in the deaf dormitory, refused to take was Okay, thank you. She was able to purchase a bare bones apartment, literally no walls, and she worked very hard to find only deaf workers to work on her apartment and establish it as a nice place to live. And there's a picture of her in the park right outside her house. After Yitpin was enclosed, she was able to make it out on foot. She walked to the train station from this area, which is about 25 kilometers outside of Kyiv, and she and her daughter were able to evacuate to Europe. She's in Italy right now, and her daughter is in Germany. And this is what is left of Yitpin. So I contacted her and asked her for her permission to use that photograph of herself with her dog. And she said, of course, my heart still hurts even now. When I lived in Yitpin, I was really happy. Yitpin is a future European. So I'm gonna end there. I have a lot more that I could say about this, but one of the things that this really highlighted for me is how much movement there already was, how independently the Ukrainian community was already making connections. She moved to Italy because she had connections in Italy. Her daughter went to Germany because she had connections in Germany. And so I think as upsetting as all of this is, how disruptive this was of the trajectory that I had imagined was actually in process. There are so many new questions to open and to ask about what Ukrainian deaf sociality and identity will become in these new locations. Will they return home? Will they remain and become part of other deaf communities? How will USL and Ukrainian deaf people contribute to a new understanding of Europeanness? And what will they bring back to Ukraine? I mean, will this supercharge the trajectory towards deaf inclusion in the making of the Ukrainian state? So thank you.
Can folks hear me in the room? Yeah, I can see the interpreter. Can I share my screen? Looks it, the host needs to enable screen sharing in order for me to do that. So just let me know when that happens. Ah, all right, perfect, there we go. Okay, can folks see my screen in the conference room? Is that a yes?
Yes, we've got your slides up.
Excellent, thank you. Thanks for your flexibility with this. I know we are running a little bit behind time, so I will do what I can to move things along. So my name is Caitlin Coons. I'm a graduate student at University of Texas at Austin. I work on signed languages in the US and Mexico, and today I'll be talking about some work I've done on a Miranda rights case, focusing on how literal language creates barriers to due process for deaf defendants. So before I begin, I would like to take a moment to discuss how my work is positioned and what influences me as I think about my work. I'm hearing from a hearing family, and I'm a white queer woman who acquired ASL as a teenager. I've been an ASL signer and active in the US deaf community for about 15 years. And I've worked in close collaboration with deaf signers in both the US and Mexico. When I focus on documenting signed languages in a way that is accessible to deaf communities and supports their community-led efforts for linguistic access, I will be presenting in spoken English with ASL interpretation today, but I am happy to discuss my research in ASL with you all after this panel. The work I will present here would not be possible without the support and hard work of deaf community members, including a certified deaf interpreter, Linda Carroll, who acted as an expert witness in 1999 on the quality of the sign interpretation provided in the case that I'm about to discuss. As a second sign language user, I verified my annotations and interpretation of the signing in the police interview with the interpretation documents that Linda Carroll provided to the court, and our interpretations of the signing matched very closely. So, legal language is highly polysemous and complex to the point that even native English speakers may have difficulty understanding legal language, and particularly Miranda rights documents or Miranda waivers, which are the waivers that police are required to give to people saying you have the right to remain silent, anything you can say will be used against you in court. That is required by law to be provided, and people need to provide their voluntary and knowing waiver of those rights before they speak to police. Education, cognitive abilities, the context in which the waiver is provided, the manner it's provided in, written, spoken, through video, and even the specific wording can greatly impact how understandable those waivers are. And across jurisdictions, the waivers vary quite significantly. Some waivers are so complicated that they're considered postgraduate reading level, which is not accessible to the majority of the population, hearing or deaf. Because of this, deaf people face many barriers to due process in the legal system, as their participation relies on their linguistic abilities, specifically their linguistic ability in English or a signed language if the interpretation is provided in the signed language. So there's a significant amount of linguistic diversity and variable language fluency among the deaf community. The deaf community is not monolithic, but that diversity is poorly understood by officers and other members of the legal system, and can be an issue even for qualified interpreters as they're trying to provide accommodations. As a result of this, about 50% of deaf defendants may not receive due process, and they're often convicted due to ineffective linguistic accommodations, as well as legislation that has not kept up with the needs of the community. So the case that I'll discuss today is Wisconsin v. Hensley. It's a publicly available case, so I'll be using the defendant's name. George Hensley is a deaf Native American man. He was born to a hearing family, and he learned ASL from about 10 to 17 years old through enrollment at a deaf school. And he excelled in school, is considered to have above average intelligence, but did not have proficiency in English. His English reading level was about second grade. He was charged and convicted of homicide of his 2-year-old son in 1997. And the responding officer did not know ASL and used written notes with Hensley to try to communicate, before realizing that Hensley couldn't really understand what he was writing and they were having trouble communicating in written English. So they went to the police station, and the police brought in an interpreter. So the interpreter was a RID certified interpreter who had lobbied her skills as an interpreter in an ad that the police found. Upon arrival, the interpreter was instructed by police to be as literal as possible. And based on personal communication that I've had with the officer, He did this because he mistakenly believed that literal language would be easier to understand. He knew that there was this issue of the defendant potentially not understanding what was happening, and he really wanted to make sure that everything was done by the book and clear. The Miranda rights were interpreted in signed English 3 separate times over the course of 40 minutes. Now, it's important to note that signed English and ASL have different linguistic structures, and the ability to understand signed English is predicated upon understanding English. As Hensley didn't have high English fluency, he really needed interpretation in ASL, which was not provided. So this is the setup of the room. The defendant, Hensley, was in the corner, the officer was at the desk, and the interpreter was between them. So I'm going to show you a few excerpts from this case, 2 specifically from the Miranda waiver that underline that there are linguistic and cultural barriers for Hensley in understanding this waiver process. And these are barriers that other deaf defendants encounter as well in legal settings. So to the right is the transcript, and I'll play the video. It is subtitled, so it will play twice, first with the English subtitles, and the second time it will play with ASL subtitles.
Okay, you have the right to remain silent. Okay, do you understand that?
So you mean I don't have to talk?
That's right, you don't have to talk, not if you don't want to.
Why?
I'm not sure I understand what you mean by why.
Why would I not talk? I mean, why could I?
Okay, you have the right to remain silent. Okay, do you understand that?
So you mean I don't have to talk?
That's right, you don't have to talk, not if you don't want to.
Why?
I'm not sure I understand what you mean by why.
Why would I not talk? I mean, why could I?
Okay, so there are 2 very different conversations happening at this point in the interview. Now, the literal interpretation that was provided for the right to remain silent was that Hensley did not need to use his voice or to speak with his voice and could keep his mouth shut or choose not to sign, which was then a point of confusion, right? As a deaf person, the cultural context for remaining silent is different. But in this situation, we can see that that cultural context for literal language is being taken for granted. And in spoken English, remaining silent is somewhat synonymous with not having a conversation. But in the context of signed language and in deaf communities, these are not synonymous. Now, Hensley's confusion is then missed by the officer, who did not, took this questioning about why he would remain silent as being about the rights, rather than about the using his voice in this context when he was not an oral person. All right, so the second excerpt follows immediately after, where the officer's trying to figure out what's going on. There's some sort of miscommunication. And again, I'll play with English subtitles and then play again with ASL subtitles.
I'm just explaining your rights. I think you want to, I understand that, but I have to inform you of your rights. Okay, do you understand that you have that right?
I have no idea. I just came here, because I did it.
I'm just explaining your rights. I think you want to, I understand that, but I have to inform you of your rights. Okay, do you understand that you have that right?
I have no idea. I just came here, you know, because I did it.
So what I'd like to draw your attention to is that last line. It's in line 37 in the transcript. So the interpreter and the officer are operating with this understanding of how police interviews are structured, right? They know that you go to a station because you're a suspect to give a statement. You have to go through this waiver process first, and then you can start talking about things. And throughout the interview, Hensley's responses indicate that he didn't share that same understanding of the event structure. He didn't understand why he was there. He was just told that he should go to the police station. And so this conversation about his rights and whether or not he can speak with his voice or sign or talk to a lawyer was very unexpected for him. And in that final line, there's this grammatical mismatch between English and ASL. So in ASL, you can have null objects. So Hensley says, I just went there, that's what I did. And the null object, you know, refers to the most recent referent, in this case, the act of going to the station. But this is not interpreted in English. So the interpreter said, I just came here because I did it. Now, why, right? So the context of the interview is there. The event context is present in the discourse, and the interpreter is operating with this assumption about how things are going to go. And so for the interpreter, that discourse context was most salient. And so when she filled in with the pronoun it, that made the most sense, that, you know, I did it, because the discourse context was there. And so this grammatical mismatch between the two languages and the fact that the interpreter was using signed English resulted in this interpreting error that inadvertently indicated guilt. So this use of literal language that was prevalent throughout this interview in the 40 minutes of the Miranda waiver resulted in a lot of interpreting errors, both in English and ASL, and in the subsequent explanations of the rights. And Hensley did not understand his right before he was waiving them, which violated his due process. And this was litigated for 3 years while he was incarcerated without a trial. Now, to the layperson, it's not exactly clear why literal language would be used in this case, but throughout the legal system, literal language is highly privileged, and the nuances of cultural or linguistic information, pragmatic information, are not valued as highly as literal meaning. And so the police instruction here reflects a lack of understanding of the cultural and linguistic diversity of deaf defendants, and especially defendants of color. And it has serious ramifications for deaf defendants, including Hensley. It limits their institutional access in legal settings, as well as their linguistic access. Now, to address these issues, I suggest that not only should police training address signed languages and deaf communities and the diversity within that, but also that as scholars working with deaf communities, we should take an active role in increasing the linguistic access for deaf people by supporting community activism. There's been significant activism to have better linguistic accommodations in legal settings. And we should also invest in our deaf colleagues and in their works, because by doing so, we can make sure that signed languages and signing communities are more well represented, and in the future avoid situations such as this. All right, so thank you. If you have comments or questions, feel free to contact me at my email or on Twitter, and have a great day.
We mentioned at the beginning, we left the final slot open because we wanted, I mean, on the one hand, you know, we can have a conversation about the content of the papers, but we also wanted to make space for anyone who wanted to speak besides us about their experience with Leila or her effect on their lives and works. Anyone present is welcome to come up to the microphone to do so. And of course, anyone on Zoom is as well. Yeah, Judy, come on up.
I was okay a minute ago. This event would not, I don't think, exist, or at least its existence owes so much to Leila. And I wouldn't be here doing this if it weren't for her taking me under her wing as she took so many people under her wing and bringing me in and making me feel like I was a real linguistic anthropologist when I came out of a cultural program and I didn't know anybody. And I have been feeling her presence here the whole time. And I feel so very fortunate to have known her and to know that this will continue and that she will continue. And I'm going to go sit down now.
Thank you so much, Judy. Would anyone else like to speak? Yeah, please come on up.
Hello, my name is Natalie Knobloch, and I'm a co-editor of Journal of Language and Discrimination. The presentations today have been brilliant, and I would like to invite every author to please consider our journal for your future publications. The issues you have been raising here are extremely important to publicize as widely and loudly as we can. So I'm encouraging you to please consider our journal and submit your research for publication to us. So if anyone has questions, please see me. I would be more than happy to talk about the journal and what we do. And I would like to invite you to publish with us again. Thank you so much.
Hello, this is such a fascinating panel. So I'm glad I was able to wake up in time for it, for actually most of it. So I have a couple of questions, and one is for Richard. I was extremely fascinated and heartened to better understand the dynamics of culture making in Nicaragua. And I wanted to ask you, because there's been recent work that I find also very fascinating on pro-tactile. And I was wondering whether in Nicaragua there might be anything happening there in terms of pro-tactile. And I'm curious because, so there's been descriptions of what's happening in the US about pro-tactile and how there's also perhaps some new culture, a new language emerging among pro-tactile users. And so I would be curious whether there's something similar in Nicaragua and how that might compare with the situation in the US. Then the other question was about the ASL in courts and how literal language might interfere with understanding that context. And I was thinking of what happened, for example, in the case of the Zimmerman case in the Florida courts, when it was clear that because Rachel Gentel, the star witness of the prosecution, she used a variant of AAE, African American English, so the jurors could not trust her. They found her unreliable, untrustworthy, not because of what she said, but because of how she said it. So I wonder, on top of the issue of literal language, whether there might be also an issue of just simple prejudice that might interfere with understanding, with communication there. Because I think what John Rickford and Cherise King showed is that when testimony is being presented by someone with what's being perceived as an accent, sheer xenophobia or sheer prejudices can interfere with communication on top of just the linguistic differences between what's being spoken and what's being heard. So, thank you for the presentation.
So just because of the order of the questions, I'll jump in first and then defer to our last presenter. So this issue of pro-tactile, which a signing that's accessible to people who are blind, clearly in ASL, if you haven't got the vision, something's got to change in order for that transmission. And in Nicaragua, there is some general disability awareness And blindness often ended up being brought into some of the conversations that I saw that included deafness, because in both cases, language is problematic, or at least the language barriers becomes problematic. I have not seen much work appearing in there, but prompted by this, I'm going to be reaching out to Marie Coppola, who's one of the ones that has been most recently been doing work down there with parents of deaf kids and finding out how much is there. At this point, we're still trying to get a lot of kids who are just in home signing environments brought into some of the educational places. And then as a segue to the next question, one of the things that came up in Nicaragua frequently was the need for interpreters, and interpreters were very rare in Nicaragua, and they didn't, most of them for quite a while, didn't have a formal training. And finally, the Swedes did set up some kind of a training process so that there could be a sort of certified interpreter for in many cases, the courts would be, they'd send a runner to the deaf club. And I remember being there at one point and they're saying, they need somebody down at the courthouse now to interpret because we've got a witness or a defendant or somebody and they can't understand them. And what was often the case is that signer or that deaf person might only be a home signer even. And so you had your interpreters dealing with that. And so sometimes a team of both a deaf person and a hearing interpreter would go to deal with that. And I am sure that there were cases where things didn't go so well because of that. And so with that, then I'll step aside for the answer to the following question.
Yes. So your question was about whether or not there's linguistic discrimination in these settings, right? So yes, of course. So because of the briefness of the presentation that I gave here, I presented a very limited analysis of this Miranda waiver. But of course, there is this underlying autism in the legal setting, as well as linguistic discrimination against people who use dialects that are considered non-standard. So in this case, yes, this part of the issue, one of the issues with this case was that the defendant is Native American and used a dialect of ASL that is influenced by Plains Indian Sign Language. So there was also this issue with less commonly understood dialects with the interpreter. And it's not just simply about literal language, but also how it interfaces with the language that defendants use. And the way the average person uses language is very different from how it's used in legal settings. So it's a confluence of issues, including especially linguistic discrimination and autism.
We are about 1 minute from time. So if there's anyone else who has any final comments, particularly about Leila, they're welcome to make them. And I myself will just say, I want to echo what Judy said. So I had an opportunity in the paper to speak about Leila's influence and legacy broadly, but also I will just add that personally, I fully echo your sentiment that she was played a huge role in helping bring people into our subfield and create a welcoming, vibrant space that we should all be continuing in that part of her legacy. Absolutely.
I wanted to make my comments from here just for the visibility aspect. When this panel was originally proposed, it was pre-COVID, but it was also at a time when Leila was doing better with her medical issues. And I remember reaching out to her, telling her that this panel was forming, and I was wondering if she was interested in coming into it. But she was dealing with heavy loads of other stuff while she was navigating medical care. And so it didn't surprise me. And I had known these were issues, but it didn't surprise me that she didn't join the panel. But she said, I'll be there. And indeed she is. So earlier this year, and I'm not the only one that's going to get emotional. Earlier this year, when I got news that Leila had gone into hospice, and as somebody who's gone through cancer treatment myself, I kind of knew what that meant. And then my first thought was, I would really like it if we could do this panel in honor of her, because she was so much a foundation of everything that was here. And I reached out to Erika and to Anne, and they said, absolutely, this is a good idea. So then I reached out to Leila because I wanted to make sure that she was okay with this. Especially because at that time she was still around. And in that last conversation with her, she said, absolutely, that would be great. You have my green light. And then her parting shots were, I love you. And that's what was underneath so much of her work. Everywhere she went, she saw people. She saw where things were working or how things could work better. She was constantly enabling and lifting up people. She was constantly learning herself. And so she herself was evolving with each of these actions. Something was growing. She was an emergent phenomenon. And I think that that's one of the things that pulled me into this subfield. I mean, my sister's work was what got me started. But then what kept me in there and what kept me coming from the linguistic anthro approach was very much because of Leila. And as a junior faculty member, she tossed that annual anthropology review request to me. And that was really important for my own trajectory. But at the same time, she was still working on that Many Ways to Be Deaf book. And it was getting so big, the publisher was saying, can't be big enough. So she cut her own material out. She didn't put in a chapter that she was going to do on some of her own ethnographic work and limited herself to an introductory piece. So she was always willing to step aside and defer. And that gave so many of us. And that's why I insisted that even though she tried to toss that annual review article to me, I insisted that she joined because she needed that recognition. She had done so much. And so she was willing to do that. So Leila, thank you so much for how much you've done everywhere. We saw on social media literally hundreds of people expressing how important she and her work and even just who she was as a loving human was. And you can't have much better than that. Thank you.
Thank you all. And now we'll be seating the room.